Hey guys, so we've had several events post Rage of the Abyss at this point, so as usual, I want to provide a tier list of the best hand traps and staples based on data from topping lists from YCS and regional level events, as well as what's being played online as well. And as always, definitely check out those discount codes for UU singles as well as supplies. Keep an eye out for those quarter century Bonanza pre-orders as well. Also, as always, a shout out to YGOProduct.com as well as Ivan for keeping up with all of the meta-relevant tops as well as the topping deck list. Anyways, let's just get into the tier list of the best hand traps and staples for this month. So we are starting with Ash Blossom. This is not really a surprise anymore. Not only is it good in terms of just hitting everything, but you know what, nowadays with Fuwalos in the mix, you kind of need it as essentially extra copies of Call by the Grave really to try to negate that if you're the one going first and they drop Fuwalos on you. So I think really important in this current format. And Imperm, of course, especially with like Snake Eye being very common, especially when you look at Snake Eye and also Snake Eye Fire King, which if you were to combine the two, then they would have the most tops in the current format. So Imperm is going to be nice. Not playing to talents, sure, is technically nice, but realistically, I think if you're playing Imperm, you're probably playing so many other hand traps anyway, so you know what, you're probably going to play into talents no matter what. And then Call by the Grave, this has been pretty popular lately because it's just so good, aside from, as I mentioned, Fuwalos, trying to stop that, but you also have a lot of hand traps in general. But on top of that, also when you're going second, this can hit a lot of things, like let's say Phantom Yubel, you have something like Heretic Seals, which would summon out Karaki Mirror Dragon otherwise, and even against, let's say, something like Snake Eyes, like Asmina stuff, like the Omni Negate, you can also call by that. So there's just a lot of applications for this card right now, so I think it's just definitely needed in your main deck. So we have Molcharmi, Perilia, and Fuwalos. Technically, Fuwalos got ranked lower because it wasn't played as much as Perilia, but realistically, I think it's pretty clear that's most likely because of sort of money reasons, right? Because it's a very expensive card, it's very understandable. Even at the regional level events, there's going to be a lot of players that are not going to are not willing to buy, you know, a playset of Fuwalos. Even Perilia is actually pretty expensive. So really, if the cost was not a factor, I'm sure these cards would actually be played even more. So that is something to consider, but you really cannot underestimate like how strong they are, especially in combination with each other. You have something like Tenpai that's actually very popular and doing quite well right now. I mentioned earlier about Snake Eye Fire King. If you were to combine them, they would be first, but if you were to split them apart, then Tenpai actually has the most tops at regional level and YCS level combined, and they're going to have a great time playing this, especially because they're going second deck, so it's always going to be live for them in game 1 situations, assuming that it's not a Tenpai mirror. And then so moving on, we have D-Barrier, which because of Fuwalos actually, and I guess to a lesser extent Perilia, this is one of the things that's very popular along with something like Thrust, so that you play something like D-Barrier or different Dimension Ground or even Threatening Nor, just like these kind of turn skip cards so that you don't commit too much so that your opponent doesn't draw. You kind of try to skip their turn and then it comes back to you. So this is going to be unfortunately pretty popular, and maybe one of the reasons Konami still hasn't banned it yet, just in case for Fuwalos. And then you have Cosmic Cyclone. This technically I think fell a little bit compared to last month, but you know what, it's still a really good card. I guess maybe because Yubel fell a little bit, I don't know if that's the reason why, but you look at some of the top decks, you know, as I mentioned, against Tenpai, comes up against like, I guess Snake Eye stuff, maybe like the Azumina stuff, and there's still Yubel as well. So you know what, I think it's still great and it's very flexible. Feather Duster, not really much to say about there, just back row removal, why not? Talents, we talked about this a little bit earlier. There's a lot of hand traps nowadays. I believe a median number of like 15 hand traps in the main and the topping deck list if you watch my YCS top cut breakdown. So it's going to be really strong. Droll is interesting. So this is a little bit higher than last month. Not necessarily because of like some of the decks that are in the top cut right now. At least that's my guess, is that for example, some people, like let's say like some Yubel players, they'll just like Droll themselves really just to prevent the opponent from drawing so much off Fuwalos. So that's kind of an interesting take at it. I guess it can definitely be useful in that regard. Although we also have started to see some Mermail pop here and there, as you would have seen also. It actually won the Toronto Regional, which is very impressive by my friend Chris. So Droll is one of the hand traps that will, at least one of the hand traps that actually would do anything against Mermail, because otherwise you're just going to straight up lose with their hand rip kind of strategies. Obviously it's still rogue territory at this point, but you know what, I think that's at least you know that Droll is still around in the format. Bestials, this I think also fell a little bit since last month. I mean, you know what, it's still good. I mean, Yubel, sure, maybe fell off a little bit, but there's still a lot of different Fiendsmith variants, and you also have something like Tenpai that's very popular, and they're going to run at least Magmat so that they can actually search your dragon in the end phase, so it really comes useful. Impulse, so this is an incredibly strong card if you can play it. I would say it's sort of in this B tier for two reasons. One, the main reason being that, of course, because it locks out of, like earth, wind, and light effects, like there's just going to be several decks that are not going to be able to play it, unfortunately, which isn't necessarily fair, especially when you think about the time that this card came out, and there's all these like fire decks, for example, that are really, really strong, and they happen to also be able to get to play Impulse, and then you have all these other rogue or older decks that just cannot because of their attribute. The other reason why it's probably not seeing a lot of play too is kind of like Flawless. It is an expensive card, and it's actually, I believe, still increasing in price. So those are a couple barriers to this card being in a higher tier than this, but nonetheless, if you can play it, it is an incredibly strong card, essentially like Solemn Strike from hand. Really, really powerful. And then we have Thrust, which we spoke a little bit earlier in terms of when you hit with like a Mold Charming, you use Thrust set something like D-Barrier or Threatening Roar or Magic Deflector or, different Dimension Ground, like all these turn skip cards. So I think it's going to be a really strong card, this format. And fortunately, it actually is going to get reprinted in that Quarter Century Bonanza set that's coming out soon. So for those of you that held out on buying this card, good for you. It's going to be essentially like a bulk super at this point. And then you move on to Nibiru. So usually whenever I see Nibiru on here, it's sort of like higher than what I thought it would be, considering like the top decks in the format. This time around, I actually want to say seems lower than what it should be, just because, especially with like the Mold Charmies being so popular, I kind of assumed they would want to draw into some like bombs like Nibiru, which is going to be can be pretty strong. Of course, some decks like, let's say like Yubel or like Tenpai doesn't really come up that much, but for a lot of different decks, you usually can actually do some damage. So definitely let me know in your in the comments what you think about Nibiru in the current format. So next you have Droplet. I guess this is more popular than Dark Ruler right now. I guess they kind of tend to flip back and forth. So, being a quick play has its advantages, can be flexible, especially against something like Tenpai, which can be used in the damage step. The unfortunate side is if they do have Shifter, or rather they drew it, then Droplet becomes kind of dead there. And also, while it's not really much of a concern currently, this new format, because you haven't seen Chimera top that much anymore, but that Diabell's card that just kind of forces you to set everything first really, really hits any kind of like quick play board breakers like Super Poly, Droplet, Book of Eclipse hard. But you know what, I guess fortunately that deck is not seeing as many tops, but Droplets otherwise very, very strong. So next we have Veiler, which I don't think there's much for me to say, really. I mean, I guess if you, let's say, resolve any of the Mold Charmies and you draw some cards, you maybe use Nibiru or let's say Bishu, and now you control a card, at least you can still use Veiler if you draw into it, unlike something like Imperm. White Forest can also search this, but you've actually seen a big decline in something like White Forest decks topping, at least so far into this few weeks after post Rage of the Abyss. Next you have Lightning Storm, which again, not much to say about this one either, just in terms of generic board wipe. Tenpai, you have a lot of those, and also I guess you have something like, Fiendsmith stuff being popular, and like with Caesar, usually they put in attack mode just because it has low defense, and at least Lightning Storm can clear that. And then you have Dimension Shifter, and as I always say, if this card could be played in a lot of different decks, then you're obviously going to see this go into higher tiers because it's a very strong card if you can play it. Realistically, most decks cannot. You have something like, let's say, Tenpai Dragons that's really popular that's playing this. You have something like Ritual Beasts that play it really well under it. And then you have other decks like, let's say, Flandres, Kashira, that usually you would see a lot of play because of Shifter. Really, they've actually kind of fallen off, especially for Flunder as well. Next, you have Ghost Ogre. This has been sort of, I guess, creeping up in terms of popularity, especially compared to last month as well. I mean, I guess there are some applications we've already kind of considered, like Tenpai Field Spell, like Yubel, for example. It kind of saw a bit of play, I guess, when like Voiceless Voice was also tier 1. And then now you have like some Azumina stuff, I guess, that you can hit as well. So, you know what? I do think that if you have a lot of room for non-engine, then you would be able to fit this in. Otherwise, you probably want to prioritize some of the other hand traps that you see in this tier list. So next you have Cross-Out Designator, which seemed to have fallen a little bit compared to last month. I mean, as I mentioned, there's a lot of D-Berry being played because of like Mold Charmies and Thrust. So maybe some Tenpai players, for example, might be playing Cross-Out and like D-Barrier on the side. I've never really liked having to side D-Barrier, or rather having to side Cross-Out, just because you don't actually know if the opponent are on those cards that you're trying to cross out. I mean, it's probably likely they do, but you never actually know for sure, and you know what, it just ends up being kind of a waste. Of course, in a mirror though, this card can be really, really impactful, as we saw in like kind of like quote unquote tier 0 Snake Eye formats, but for the most part I don't think it's as popular as maybe some might have thought. And then you have Evenly Matched. This has been sort of slowly declining in terms of popularity. I think it's a great card if you can resolve it, but you know what, in the current format you do actually still have several Omni Negates out there, right? Even with like a ban of Savage and Barone, you have something, like you have the Azumina stuff that can serve as Omni Negate, Desiree, you have something like Varudris and something like Yubel. So I mean, if you can manage to get through those Omni Negates and then you evenly them, but even then it's not necessarily game over either, because you have a deck like Snake Eye that can just clap back so strong. They have such a strong recovery game. Same thing could be said for Yubel as well. And then even, let's say Centurion, that's actually a popular deck that I should have actually mentioned about, let's say with like Ghost Ogre as well, which can hit, I guess, a lot of cards in that deck. But again, Centurion, from my experience, evenly has not even been that good, even, you know, without Calamity. For example, they'll just always be able to either just make another Blazing Quasar before you go into battle phase if they used up the first one, or let's say they will still like use up or try to attempt to negate it with like Blazing Quasar. Let's say it's negated or something with Dark Ruler, and then, you know, it goes away and then it just comes right back in end phase. So they still have some plays and everything. So I think evenly is okay, only if paired with like another board breaker, and even at that, you still have to make sure your opponent can't come back by setting up your own oppressive board. And then you have different Dimension Ground. I mentioned this about with Thrust and D-Barrier, and this card, and Threatening Roar has been kind of a potential option as well to just skip the battle phase for Tenpai. And then I personally also like Magic Deflector, which sort of negates all the spell card effects that are not normal spells essentially for the entire turn, which can hit a lot of the same decks as well. This card is essentially kind of like Shifter for your opponent for that turn only, just for monsters. So honestly, can be a turn skip for a lot of different decks, and is really, really strong. This has seen some play here and there throughout competitive play in the last few years for sure, since I've been covering these videos. So then moving on to the final tier, we do have Spooky Dogwood. Unfortunately, this is still seeing a good amount of play in competitive play in terms of like topping deck lists, just because in time, it's just such a powerful card to gain your life points and auto win the match. So definitely a frustrating way to lose. Obviously on Dueling Book, you're not really going to see much of this at all because there's no time factor involved. But nonetheless, definitely not a card that you really want to see in terms of topping lists. And then Retaliating Sea, this one has been interesting. I've definitely noticed an increase in play of this online as well as I've been trying to test. So essentially it kind of serves as like almost a dimension shifter, I guess, if your opponent activates like a spell that summons essentially. And so the good thing for the player that plays Retaliating Sea is that, you know, when their turn rolls around, they can just link this off and then just play as normal, right? But for the opponent, having to have all their cards banished can be really devastating. So I think it is definitely a sleeper option for those of you preparing your side deck, depending on what kind of deck that you play. And then finally, we have Super Polyir. I actually think this is pretty good right now if your extra deck can have the space for it. I mean, you have something like Tenpai. If they shifter you, you can at least Super Poly their monsters for Garura. You probably have a good chance at surviving in that regard. Like the Azamina stuff, like in terms of what they end on, you can definitely make something like Dragos Tepilia, which is like a really good target right now. And same thing can be said for like Yubel as well, which, you know, Drago is usually like a really good option there. So, you know what? I think in terms of meta options, Super Poly can definitely be pretty solid breaking boards. All right, guys. So that was it for the best staples and hand traps in the current format post Rage of the Abyss. Hopefully it was helpful in helping you prepare your deck list for whatever events that you may have coming up. So big thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to my patrons and sponsors as always for the continued support, and well, take care, guys.